Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be part 2 of the Q&A. Considering how short these are ending up being, it's funny that it took me so long to edit this all together. It is what it is. Here we go, here's the rest of it. Bookish asked, what's your favorite hangout in Houston? And I think he really wanted to know about restaurants or bars or something, but my favorite place to hang out in Houston was Memorial Park. And all the friends I made there, I met through other people who took their dogs to different places in the park. I would say 90% of my social life and free time kind of thing when I was in Houston was based in Memorial Park. We would have parties in the park, we would meet up with the dogs there, I went hiking there probably 4 days a week, and I'll insert some photos maybe. But yeah, I think Memorial Park was key to basically my entire experience of social life and fun when I was in Houston. Pretty Brown Eye Readers asks, do you have a book that's a front runner for your favorite book of 2019? And I don't have a favorite that was released this year because I haven't been keeping up with a lot of new releases, but I think my favorite book that I read this year so far was Adam Pottle's The Bus, which is incredibly depressing, but a really worthwhile novella. I talked about it in, I think I had a wrap-up that's called 4 Short Novels, so it's in that one. Bookish Islander asked, why did I choose Wizard of the Pigeons for the giveaway, and what does that particular book mean to you? The reason I chose that particular book is because I was trying to think of something that has an appeal to people who read across genres. Because I don't sit in a particular niche when it comes to what I discuss on my channel, I know that there are people that I talk to who wouldn't be interested if I was giving away a First World War history, or wouldn't be interested if I was giving away sports writing, for example. Whereas this book, because it's both urban fantasy and has realistic elements, and also because it's written by Robin Hobb under her other pen name, and so many people seem to look at Robin Hobb as having crossover appeal. I see a lot of people who read her stuff who don't normally read fantasy, or who don't normally read adult fantasy, or who don't normally read massive series. So I felt like that would be a safe choice in that a lot of people haven't read it, but it's by an author that seems to have a lot of crossover appeal. Neetu Singh asked, I would love to know about your favorite middle grade book or author. I haven't reread it for a long time, so I don't know if Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim would still be my favorite middle grade book, but I'm gonna say that just for now. Although I will say that I read a middle grade book last year called The War That Saved My Life that I thought was particularly well done in that it worked on several levels, both educationally, because I think middle grade books often should have an educational element, but also that plot-wise it worked as a book that a child might read with a parent, or that a child might read on their own, so I thought that was very successful as well. MadeWithBooks asked, I would like to know, what are your favorite places you traveled to? I've been to some lovely beaches, but I'm not a beach person, so I really enjoy going to see something new, and that's always brilliant. My favorite thing when I travel is usually to be in a city and to just stay in one place for several days and to explore the city. And I think a lot of the time, because you think when you're traveling, especially if you're on holiday, that you should be going out and either seeing things or relaxing on a beach. And I think I often go out and do sightseeing and sit on a beach, and I don't actually enjoy that part. I mostly would prefer to be in a large city. And a walkable city. Say that because there's some cities that are large and not walkable. Houston and Chennai are 2 of them. That said, my favorite places to go back to are Istanbul and London, and because I'm a big city person, but also I like knowing where you're going, more or less. So that's maybe a lazy way. Maybe that's a cheating answer, but I do enjoy going to see any place that has a combination of old stuff and new stuff. So Tarrell asks, what is your favorite 90s animated movie? I have really ridiculously fond memories of going to see The Lion King when it first came out on opening night with a group of friends, in part because the cinema we went to first wasn't actually showing it, even though it had the advertising, so we had to walk to another one which no longer exists. It's one that used to be on Yonge Street in Toronto for Toronto people. You know, obviously it was a great movie, and it's been remade into a musical, and there's a live action version, and there were all kinds of sequels, but yeah, that was great fun. My favorite 90s Disney villain, though, is Frollo in Hunchback, because of the Hellfire song. It is such a ridiculous song to have in a children's film, but anyway. Shannon Ridler asks, if you were directing an adaptation of your favorite series, who would you cast for the lead roles? I wouldn't cast them. I'd get a casting director to do it for me. I just said this in the comments of one of Shannon's other videos. I don't have a lot of favorite actors. There are definitely actors that I look at and go, well, they're terrible. But if they're attractive or have a good singing voice and it's a musical, and you don't then it doesn't matter that they can't act. Or on the flip side, maybe they're great at accents and terribly ugly, but you go, okay, they can. I don't know, I'm not super attached to that. And then the additional question is, what format would you adapt them to? Actually, you know what would be a great adaptation? I think this series, which I forget what the series name is, but the Black Con is the second one, the first one is the Blood Prince. Anyway, I think this would be such fun to see a super cheesy, like 60-part TV series of. That would be entertaining. I would watch that. And because some of the characters here are described purely in terms of, ooh, this is the most attractive person ever, I think it would be hilarious to just have a bunch of really good-looking, terrible actors in it. That would be fun. And it would be like a costume drama, because this is a sort of pseudo-13th century novel series, whatever. Milan T asks, do you ever find yourself becoming more and more critical of a book within a series as the series progresses? I think what I become critical of is whether the books needed to be published as a series. I think especially in, for example, epic fantasy, there are a lot of books that are just drawn out, where a good editor could have cut those in half. And so it's not necessarily that I'm more critical as it progresses, it's that the fact that it's continuing to progress is something that I'm critical of. I also think in a lot of mystery series, a lot of them become very same at a certain point. So, yeah, I do become critical of that. Because even if they have a fun hook regarding the setting or the sleuth or whatever, the sameness gets to be a bit much. And here's the complicated question. Laura Fry asked, did you experience any culture shock when you moved to the States? Are there any books that helped you make sense of America, or the South, or Texas, etc.? I'm curious because when my sister moved from Canada to the States, she was surprised by how much culture shock she experienced. And the answer there is yes. And I was surprised by how much cultural shock I experienced too, in part because my mother's 3 youngest siblings all live in North Carolina. And so I have cousins who are American, and I felt like I had a sense of American culture and everything, but even so, yeah, there was a lot of culture shock. I think a lot of that is because of demographic differences, both in terms of, well, I mean, in terms of almost everything. A lot of the messaging about class in the US would lead you to think that there's a lot more class flexibility than there is in maybe other Western countries, but it seems like it's almost the opposite, and there's a lot more stratification. And so seeing that and being a person who kind of didn't recognize the signs of it necessarily, especially when people would talk about small universities or things in Texas specifically, people would talk about having grown up in the cotillion club, and then you'd see other people comment, oh, you must have been really rich, and cross-generationally too. I remember having a conversation where a man in his late 70s was commenting on how upper class that meant this one guy in his 50s and this one girl in her late 20s must have been because they were in the cotillion club. And then the guy in his 50s was asking the younger woman, was telling her that, you know, he'd been an escort for several debutantes and what was her debutante experience, and she commented that, well, she was Jewish, so she couldn't be a debutante. Yeah, and I and a friend of mine who grew up in New Jersey, or who moved to New Jersey when she was 10, she's originally from India, and we were both sitting there going, what is this? This sounds horrific. Yeah, so I think some of that is more Texas culture or Southern kind of culture as opposed to American culture, because as I said, my friend who grew up in New Jersey was shocked by some of it. But yeah, a lot of that class stuff. And also a lot of ethnic and religious demographics are just so different. Like Americans as a whole, I find, are more likely to be religious, and if they're religious, are more likely to be observant or practicing. And also just the demographics are different within religions, that they have more Protestants than Catholics within Christianity. That I think in the US, and I remember looking this up at one point because I was talking about a shawarma place that had these pork kebabs, and I was like, what the hell? Because where I grew up, I mean, even the Greek restaurants are halal where I grew up, right? So anyway, and people didn't know what that meant, and so I had looked up the demographics, and it's interesting. In the US, the only religion other than Christianity that has a full percentage point of the population is Judaism. And I mean, in Canada, Judaism is like the 5th religion and is also over 1%. And so you have this expectation that in the general culture, people should be more aware of other religions. It's just a very different demographic thing. Just the expectations are different. Like if you meet a white or black American, they probably have much deeper roots in the United States than if you meet a white or black Canadian who are probably within a couple of generations from somewhere else. The exception of French Canadians, obviously. And there's a much smaller percentage of Indigenous people in the US too. So the whole framework on which people discuss things like class and religion and ethnicity is completely different. And you don't necessarily notice it from TV, so you get there and you have certain expectations of and they turn out to be different. I think it's funny, the book that kind of explained what I now know as the myth of American exceptionalism was a book that I read about a month after I moved out of Houston, which was called Notes from a Foreign Land, I think. And it was about an American who went and lived in Turkey for a few years. And in this book, this woman kind of breaks down how Americans view the rest of the world and kind of the national mythology. So I wish that book didn't exist when I first moved to the US, because I moved there in 2013. I lived in the DC area for 2 years, and then I lived in Houston for 3 years. But it really explained to me how Americans frame their own experience of both their own history and their relationship to their own kind of nationalism and stuff. So that was interesting. Also, the weather is really different in Houston. It was somewhat different in DC. We did have, I mean, it snows sometimes, but not often enough for them to have plows, so that was a whole thing. I was in Houston the one day of the year where they had, like, snow in the morning and then ice, and nobody can drive in ice there. It was wild. But I just realized that to end this on a more lighthearted note, one of the biggest cultural weirdnesses about the US is how early the donut shops close. That sounds ridiculous, but for example, when I lived in Houston, we had a Shipley's that was only about like 300 meters from the house. And when we first moved there, it closed at 2:30 in the afternoon. Later on, they switched it so that it would close at 5:30, but still incredibly early. I was recently visiting the sister of a friend of mine in Western New York, so just across the border here, where they have the chain Tim Hortons, the same as we have in Canada. But there, it was, when I left her house to drive home at 10:30 at night, it was closed. Whereas here, you can get donuts almost 24 hours a day, or at least until 11 p.m. So yeah, that's a real culture shock. So there's a lot of cultural stuff going on. I think that's the last question. Thank you to everybody who sent in a question, and thank you to everybody who has subscribed. I've really enjoyed getting to know everybody, so I hope this was fun. And yeah, that's it for now. Ciao.